So, but one question that I actually wanted to ask to you, since you have more of a firsthand familiarity with the political dynamics of Canada, is something that sparked my interest when I was reading that Law Review article that I mentioned earlier. And in the article, the author Peter Rosenthal goes through briefly the history of the October crisis of 1970, which we mentioned was the most recent time that this authority was invoked by the Canadian government. And he says that, quote, the government's 1970 use of the War Measures Act to suppress civil liberties in Quebec does not have many defenders in retrospect, although few dared to oppose the imposition of war measures during the hysteria of the crisis itself. And of course, as we mentioned, the sort of dissatisfaction with how the War Measures Act was utilized during that period actually led to the drive to enact a different law that ostensibly has some more protections, but is vague enough where pretty much it affords the same powers to the government should it be invoked. So I'm sort of wondering if you think this current invocation of the Emergencies Act will follow a similar trajectory in that it seems, at least on the surface, to have relatively widespread support in Canada and maybe even to some degree in the U.S. to the extent that the issue is known about. Do you think, will it in the future be looked back on as a dangerous kind of encroachment on civil liberties, or do these truckers have so little kind of popular support that people will be willing to kind of set aside whatever reservations that they may have from a civil liberties standpoint and just support whatever the government needs to do to kind of terminate this alleged threat?
Well, I think where we are right now is we're too close to the quote unquote, I don't see it as a crisis. I just see it as a protest, but we're too close to it. And there are a lot of people who are angry and upset who live in Ottawa that are like, well, just get them the fuck out already. So I don't care what measures you have to undertake to make sure that this happens. Just go ahead and do it. There's a lot of people who are sympathetic, especially because, like I said, many of the organizers of the convoy are the same people that were causing a lot of trouble and inflaming incredibly anti-immigrant and downright racist rhetoric back in 2018 and 19. So a lot of people are deeply unsympathetic towards the convoy, and have the fact that there were Nazi flags and swastikas being flown right in front of the Parliament building. It's just a bad look. So for them, they're like, yep, get them out of there by whatever means necessary. And I think this short-sighted worldview where it's whatever powers the government has to afford unto itself to end this charade, just go ahead and do that. I think in retrospect, once this ends up getting used, and I have no doubt that it will, be used on other legitimate protests for movements that we actually sympathize with, I think they're going to realize the mistake way too late. So I think the enablement of the federal government and the support for the federal government to undertake these measures it might look like a good idea right now. You're not going to like it so much when, let's say, there's another protest movement for Black Lives or another protest movement for Indigenous reconciliation or land back. You're not going to like it so much then.
And I'm curious if you have any sympathy on any level with kind of the fundamental grievances. I know it's now a hodgepodge and it's sort of strayed from what seemed to be the initial impetus, which was opposition, somewhat narrowly, I guess, to the vaccine mandate for border crossings.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that such mandates are the most tyrannical imposition that any government has undertaken. At the same time, it seems like the drive to ensure compliance with that mandate is not really at all related anymore to public health. I mean, does anyone really care that much, or does anyone really think that they're at physical, literal danger if a trucker driving alone in his truck, for vast distances is not vaccinated? I think that stretches credulity. What seems to me is that the zeal with which that mandate is being pursued and enforced by the government, you see this also replicated in certain localities in the U.S., is really an
Yeah.
ideological. It's like an ideological motive. It's that this is what nice liberal democracies ought to do. This is a government power which ought to be accepted by everybody who has kind of bought into our social compact. And if you don't, or if you kind of deviate from that compact, then you're a threat. I mean, I think it connects back to that kind of broader sort of theory about rising liberalism that we mentioned earlier, that was exposited by Friedland and Trudeau and others. So I'm just curious, I guess, if you, on a personal level, sympathize with that grievance at all, like kind of leaving aside more of the kind of wacky stuff that maybe got glommed onto it.
Don't you know that I'm a woke liberal, and therefore anything that conservatives are for, I'm necessarily
Oh
going
yeah, I
to
mean,
push down or
I
like
think
about
it's
me?
a sound way of reasoning. Anyway, moving on.
No. I'm
I know,
joking.
I know, I
No,
know.
I think that there is. I've said I mean, from the get-go that yeah, there is a legitimate grievance there. I think that because I'm not sure like how familiar you are with I'm not trying to be condescending. I'm just saying like not a lot of people are familiar with how Canada's doing with regards to the pandemic. But
Yeah, I'm not, like, I guess,
some
somewhat familiar. Because I was there for a couple of weeks
yeah.
last year, where they actually for thanks. I was there during Canadian Thanksgiving when they actually reimposed certain kind of quasi lockdown measures in like Newfoundland
Which
and
was
places and stuff.
inevitable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, of the total Canadian population, about 80% of people are vaccinated, and of the eligible population, about close to 85% of the population is vaccinated. So, in any sort of like public initiative where the government can get 85% of people to do a thing, that is a wildly successful initiative. You are never going to get 100% of people to do anything. So then the question is, if your strategy relied on 100% of people to do the thing that you wanted them to do, it's then whatever you were planning is an absolute failure. Like, how are you planning to account for the people that are non-compliant? And that's kind of what's happened with the vaccine-only strategy, is that you're relying on 100% compliance, and whether it's incentivizing or coercing or just downright forcing people to do a thing, you are never going to achieve 100% compliance. And there are other measures that could be taken to get higher compliance, and there's other measures that can be undertaken to make sure that we can actually get past the pandemic. One of the biggest problems, for example, is that um, people think that Canada gave like a universal basic income to all Canadians. That didn't happen. What happened was if you ended up losing a job or losing out on a significant portion of your income because of the lockdowns and because of COVID, then you could apply for the CERB, the Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit, which provided about $2,000 a month, which is it's not bad. It's not going to cover everything, but it certainly helps. I mean, it's more than most Americans got. The problem with that is that if you were disabled, you were very likely to have not had a job in the first place. And if you applied for the CERB benefit, now that everything is locked down, you have to have delivery services, bring your food, etc. You still have your day-to-day needs. You probably still have medical needs and conditions, and if they're not being treated on a regular basis, then your bills are simply piling up because you're getting sicker and sicker. Now, the problem with that is that the solution that the federal government came up with was, well, just go ahead and apply for CERB anyway. We'll still give it to you. But if it turns out you weren't qualified for CERB after the program ends, then we will simply add whatever we gave you to your total tax bill. So we're going to tax you on that amount that you got, meaning you're going to have a tax bill that you simply cannot pay back by the time this whole thing is over. I mean, that's the best that we can do for now. So our government didn't actually undertake the necessary measures to make sure that they could A, get the necessary amount of compliance, and B, have people have their day-to-day needs met so that they didn't have to go out and work, and that they didn't have to go out and get groceries, supplies, and other assorted items, and also be able to like see their families and whatever sort of dependencies that they had, whether physical, emotional, or otherwise. You still have to be able to like go out and be able to see people, or have people come over to see you if you have special needs. We didn't take care of that. So that to me is a massive public health failure. And then depending on mandates and vaccine passports to close the rest of that 15% gap is to me just throwing your hands up and saying, sorry, we've got nothing else. So I think that truckers taking matters into their own hands and driving down to Ottawa to, raise their flags in protest, or even going to border crossings and blocking the border until something changes. Now, do I think that they have any goals past simply lifting the mandates and passports or getting what they want? No, absolutely not. Like, I don't see this as like a massive workers' uprising demanding more rights, better pay, better working conditions, etc. I don't see it as that because that's not what they're asking for. But at the same time, they do have a legitimate grievance.
Yeah, I think the point about 100% compliance being unattainable is an important one, in part because it's inevitably going to produce a minority that is increasingly recalcitrant and even gets radicalized because they're being kind of excluded from all manner of engagement in just the ordinary public domain. Like I know in Canada, there's a proposal. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think it's been enacted yet, but about even having cross-provincial travel require vaccine proof of vaccine, and on and on and on with measures like that. And I think, yeah, I mean, so you're pursuing an irrational goal in the first place, and it's just going to disillusion and inflame that minority, which was never going to comply anyway.
Thanks for listening. To listen to full live episodes of the Unredacted show with Glenn Greenwald and me, Q Anthony Omene, find us on Callin. Download the app from the App Store on iPhone or iPad to join the conversation live every Thursday at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time.